A newlywed husband's shocking discovery of his wife's identity spirals into betrayal and deadly obsession. Why did a loving husband end up as a suspect in a Christmas Eve tragedy? And how did it all begin? December 12, 2011, 8:30 p.m. Newlyweds James and Lila Harris were celebrating their one-month anniversary. To friends and family, they seemed like the perfect couple. James, a 28-year-old contractor, was well-liked in the community. His reputation was one of hard work, loyalty, and a straightforward, no-nonsense attitude. Lila, a delicate and graceful woman with a quiet charm, had moved to Clearwater only a year before. She was 25, a waitress at a local diner, known for her kindness and beauty. Together, they seemed destined for happiness. But things weren't as perfect as they seemed. James had started noticing subtle changes in Lila's behavior. Nervous glances, quick smiles that didn't reach her eyes, moments where she seemed lost in thought. He tried to brush it off, telling himself it was just part of adjusting to married life. But deep down, he felt an unsettling tension, a sense that Lila was hiding something from him. Then one night, as they sat on the couch after dinner, a strange phone call broke the silence. Lila answered it, her voice shaky, her face pale as she listened. She didn't say much, but her expression told James all he needed to know. Something wasn't right. As she hung up, he asked who it was, but she brushed him off, muttering something about an old friend from her past. Suspicion flared in James's mind, but he kept quiet, not wanting to push her. Yet he couldn't ignore the growing feeling that his wife was keeping secrets from him. The phone call lingered in James's mind, casting a shadow over their home. Over the next few days, Lila grew more distant. She avoided eye contact, spending more time alone in their bedroom. When James tried to get her to open up, she'd change the subject or claim she was just tired. The tension between them grew thicker with each passing day. Then, on the night of December 18th, everything changed. December 18th, 2011, 10:45 p.m. It was a cold, windy night, unusual for Clearwater. James lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind rattling the windows. Lila had gone to bed hours before, but something was keeping him up. It was that same nagging feeling, like a shadow lurking at the edge of his thoughts. Unable to sleep, he got up and made his way to the kitchen. As he passed the living room, he noticed something strange. Light was coming from underneath the door of Lila's study. It was a room she usually kept locked, a place she'd told him she used for private things. He'd never questioned it, but tonight, his curiosity got the best of him. Slowly, he turned the doorknob. To his surprise, it opened. The light inside was dim, casting long shadows across the room. On the desk lay a pile of papers, and beside it a stack of old photographs. James hesitated, feeling a rush of guilt for invading her space. But his curiosity won out. He moved closer and began to sift through the papers, his fingers trembling slightly. And then he found it, a letter addressed to Lila Harrison. But it wasn't his last name. His heart pounded as he continued reading, his eyes scanning words that didn't make sense. Medical records, appointments, dates that went back years before they'd even met. And then, a word that froze him in place. Transition. It was as if the world had dropped out from under him. His mind raced, piecing together the fragments of what he was reading. Transition. It meant that Lila had been someone else before. All this time she'd kept a secret so big he could hardly wrap his mind around it. James stumbled back, the papers slipping from his hands. His mind spun with confusion, betrayal, and anger. He felt like he'd been living with a stranger, a woman who wasn't who she claimed to be. Part of him wanted to confront her right then, to demand answers, but another part held him back, unsure of how he'd react to the truth. He took a deep breath, gathered the papers back together, and placed them on the desk, trying to make it look as if nothing had been touched. Then, without another word, he retreated back to their bedroom, his mind racing with the weight of his discovery. In the darkness, he lay beside her, feeling the distance between them growing with each passing second. December 19th, 2011, 6:30 a.m. The next morning, James was up before dawn, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of cold coffee, his mind still reeling from the discovery. He kept replaying the night before, the documents he'd read, the life Lila had hidden from him. He felt torn between confronting her and keeping silent, unsure of what he would even say. The woman he loved, the woman he thought he knew, had been keeping something so fundamental about herself a secret. Lila entered the kitchen, smiling sleepily. She went to pour herself a cup of coffee, but James's tense silence made her pause. She looked at him, her smile fading, sensing something was wrong. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice gentle. James could hardly look at her. His hands tightened around the coffee mug as he fought to keep his emotions in check. Finally, he looked up, his eyes hard. "Lila, I know about last night. I saw the papers in your study." The color drained from Lila's face, and her hand trembled as she placed her coffee cup down. She stood there, frozen, knowing there was no way to explain it away, no way to avoid the confrontation she'd been dreading for so long. "Why didn't you tell me?" James demanded, his voice a mix of anger and hurt. "Why did you keep this from me?" Lila looked down, her shoulders slumping as she searched for the words. I was going to tell you, James. I just didn't know how. I was afraid of how you'd react, afraid of losing you." James shook his head, his face pale. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" "We're married, Lila. I thought we had no secrets." Lila took a shaky breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "I love you, James. I was always going to tell you, but I wanted to do it in my own time. I wanted you to see me for who I am now, not who I was." Her words only seemed to fuel his anger. He stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the tile floor. "Who you are now? What does that even mean, Lila? How am I supposed to trust anything you say? Our entire relationship, everything, feels like a lie." Lila's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out to him, but he took a step back, his face hard. She dropped her hand, her expression devastated. She wanted to explain, to make him understand, but she could see the betrayal in his eyes, the wall he'd put up between them. Without another word, James stormed out of the kitchen, grabbing his coat as he left. He needed space, time to process what he'd learned. Lila was left alone, her heart breaking, knowing that the secret she'd tried so hard to protect had now shattered everything she'd built with him. December 20th, 2011, 9 p.m. For the rest of the day, James was nowhere to be found. He didn't return any calls, and no one in town had seen him. Lila spent the day pacing the house, her mind consumed by fear and regret. She'd known this moment would come someday, but she'd hoped against hope that love would make the truth easier for him to accept. By nightfall, Lila felt hollow, drained of tears and energy. She was ready to give up waiting and go to bed when the front door creaked open. James stepped inside, his face shadowed and unreadable. He didn't look at her as he took off his coat and hung it by the door. The silence between them was thick, almost unbearable. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft and pleading. "James, please, can we talk?" He glanced at her, his face unreadable. Slowly, he walked into the living room, sinking into an armchair across from her. His gaze was cold, distant, like he was looking at a stranger. "Talk, then," he said flatly, folding his arms. Lila took a shaky breath, her heart pounding. She knew this was her last chance to make him understand. "I never wanted to lie to you. I never meant for things to get so complicated. But I loved you so much, and I was terrified of losing you." James's eyes hardened. You should have told me. I had a right to know before we got married, Lila. I thought I knew everything about you. I know, she whispered, tears filling her eyes. And I wanted to tell you so many times. But every time I tried, I was afraid it would change everything. I was afraid you wouldn't see me the same way. He leaned forward, his face inches from hers, his voice sharp and cold. It did change everything, Lila. How am I supposed to believe anything you say? How can I trust you after this? Lila's voice trembled. I'm still the same person you fell in love with. I haven't changed, James. It's just a part of my past, something I didn't know how to share, but it doesn't change who I am now. He shook his head, his expression filled with hurt and anger. You don't get it, do you? You kept this huge secret from me. Every time I look at you, I wonder what else you're hiding. I wonder if any of it was real. Lila felt a pang of despair, knowing she might never be able to make him understand. She reached out, her voice breaking. James, please, I love you. We can work through this. I'll do whatever it takes to make it right. But he stood up, pulling away from her touch. His voice was cold, final. I need time to think. I need to figure out if I can ever forgive you for this. With that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Lila alone in the dark. She listened to his footsteps fade down the hallway, the sound echoing in her chest like a closing door. She knew that whatever happened next, their lives would never be the same. December 21st, 2011, 2 a.m. In the quiet hours of early morning, Lila lay awake, replaying the events of the past day in her mind. She could barely remember the last time she felt so helpless, the last time she felt like her life was slipping out of her control. She clung to the hope that James's anger might cool, that he'd remember the love they shared and come back to her. But deep down, a part of her feared she'd lost him forever. Suddenly, she heard a noise from downstairs. A creak, the sound of something shifting in the dark. Her heart raced. She sat up, listening intently. Maybe it was just her imagination playing tricks on her in the silence of the night. But then she heard it again, the faint rustle of movement. Carefully, she slid out of bed and crept to the doorway, her breath held tight in her chest. The house was dark, save for a faint glow from the streetlight filtering through the windows. She moved cautiously down the stairs, her hand gripping the railing as she peered into the dimly lit living room. There, standing in the shadows, was James. He was holding a glass in one hand, staring out the window, his back to her. Lila's heart sank at the sight of him, looking lost, troubled, more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. James, she whispered, stepping closer. He turned to her slowly, his eyes heavy with something darker, more troubled than before. Couldn't sleep, he murmured, his voice thick and distant. He raised the glass to his lips, taking a slow, deliberate sip, his gaze never leaving her. Lila felt a chill run through her. Something in his expression was different, colder, more resolute. She hesitated, feeling a strange sense of unease, as though she was standing in front of someone she didn't fully recognize. James, I know I hurt you, but please, don't shut me out. We can get through this. We can fix this, she said softly, desperate to reach him. He set the glass down on the table, his movements slow and deliberate. You think it's that easy, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. You think you can just confess everything and it'll go away? She took a step back, sensing the anger simmering beneath his calm demeanor. I just want a chance to make things right. I love you, James. I've always loved you. He shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. Love? You call this love? You lied to me, Lila. You betrayed me. His voice grew sharper, each word laced with resentment. You took away my choice. You made me a fool. Tears filled her eyes. I didn't want to hurt you. I was afraid of losing you. I didn't know how to tell you. I thought it wouldn't matter." "But it does matter," he snapped, his voice breaking. "It matters because you let me believe a lie. You let me think I knew you. You let me fall in love with someone who doesn't even exist." Lila felt the weight of his words like a blow to the chest. She reached out, trying to close the distance between them, but he pulled away, his face twisted with anger. "You don't understand, Lila. This isn't something I can just forgive. This isn't something I can ignore," he said, his voice cold, detached. She felt her hands shaking as she whispered, "So, what are you going to do?" For a moment, he didn't answer. He simply stared at her, his gaze piercing, unyielding. Then, in a low, ominous tone, he replied, "I'm going to make sure you never forget what you did to me." The words hung in the air, filling the silence with a palpable sense of dread. Lila felt her heart pounding as she took a step back, her mind racing. She didn't know what he meant, but she could feel the weight of his anger, the depth of his resentment, and in that moment she realized just how far he might go to make her pay. December 24th, 2011, 11:45 p.m. The night before Christmas was cold and eerily quiet. Lila sat alone in her bedroom, the house wrapped in darkness. She'd barely seen James over the past few days. He came and went without a word, his silence thick and unbreakable. She'd tried to talk to him, to bridge the chasm that had opened between them, but every attempt was met with a hard, empty gaze or bitter silence. That night, as the clock neared midnight, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle over her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was coming, something she couldn't control. She sat in the dim room, the only light coming from the small flickering candle on her nightstand, her mind racing with fear and regret. Suddenly, she heard the faint creak of the floorboards outside her door. Her pulse quickened. She'd been on edge for days, afraid of the quiet tension that filled the house, afraid of what James might do next. She held her breath, listening as the footsteps grew closer. The door opened slowly, and there he stood, his face half hidden in the shadows. He looked tired, worn, but his eyes were hard, resolute. "James, please, we don't have to do this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. He didn't say anything, just stared at her with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. She could see the pain etched on his face, the betrayal that still lingered in his gaze. "Do you know what today is?" he finally asked, his voice cold and steady. Lila nodded, her throat tight. "It's Christmas Eve." He laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Christmas Eve," he repeated, as if the words themselves were a cruel joke. "It's supposed to be a time for family, for love and trust. But here we are, living a lie." Lila's heart pounded as she rose from the bed, her hands trembling. "James, I never meant to hurt you. I thought we could move past this." "Move past it?" he snapped, his voice rising. "How can I move past something like this? You lied to me about who you are. You made me believe in a future that never existed." Tears filled her eyes as she tried to reach him, to make him understand. "I thought if you loved me, it wouldn't matter. I thought we could make it work." He shook his head, his jaw clenched. "You stole my choice, Lila. You took away my right to decide what kind of life I wanted." She could see the anger building in him, the fury simmering just beneath the surface. She took a step back, fear gripping her as she whispered, "James, please, I'm sorry." But he wasn't listening. He moved toward her, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes fixed on her with a look that was both cold and determined. She backed up against the wall, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. "Do you think sorry is enough?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Do you think an apology can erase what you did?" Lila's heart raced as she realized just how far he was willing to go. She'd seen anger in him before, but this was different. This was a man consumed by betrayal, by a sense of justice, twisted by hurt and rage. She tried to reason with him, her voice trembling. "James, please, we can get through this. We can find a way to move forward." But he shook his head, his expression dark and unyielding. "No, Lila, there's no moving forward from this." And in that moment, as he stepped closer, she knew there was no escaping the storm that was about to come crashing down. December 25th, 2011, 2 a.m. The quiet of Christmas morning was shattered by a single piercing scream. Neighbors awoke to the sound, some peeking out their windows, others dialing the police, their hearts pounding with fear. When the authorities arrived, they found a scene of horror inside the house on Birchwood Avenue. The walls were marked with evidence of a violent struggle, and the floor was stained with blood, a grim testament to the fury that had unfolded just hours before. In the corner of the room, they found James, slumped on the floor, his hands stained red, his face a mask of shock and despair. He stared blankly ahead, unseeing as the officers approached him, their voices calm but firm. "What happened here?" one of them asked, his voice breaking through the silence. James looked up, his eyes hollow. I didn't mean for it to go this far," he whispered, his voice barely audible. But it was too late for apologies, too late for regret. The damage was done, the truth exposed, and the lives they had once shared were shattered beyond repair. As they led him out in handcuffs, the first rays of dawn broke over the quiet town, casting a pale, cold light over the scene. And as the sun rose on Christmas morning, the neighborhood stood in stunned silence, forever marked by the tragedy that had unfolded in the dark hours before dawn. The story of James and Lila would haunt the town for years to come, a chilling reminder of love turned to obsession, of secrets that once revealed could never be forgotten. And for those who remembered that fateful Christmas morning, the memory would linger, a dark shadow over the season of peace and joy.